Welcome to Climate Optimists. I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
And I'm Thomas Mills.
This week, we're going to be talking about the world of aviation, its climate impacts, and the solutions needed to bring it to zero emissions. Before we kick off today's discussion, wanted to announce that here at Climate Optimists, we will be taking a spring break the last 2 weeks of March. And, I think I'm going to probably do a little skiing, a little yard work. Todd, I assume you're taking your annual trip down to Cancun, or?
I don't know what the hell you're talking about spring break. Spring break? What are you, in high school? No, I don't get a spring break. I mean, I'm going to, what I'm going to be doing spring break? I'm going to be working. Spring break, Cancun. Thomas, do you get a spring break or what?
Not the Cancun style. Well, at least not that I've observed.
Yeah, I miss those days of spring break. I suppose I got a kid growing up, so I'm gonna.
You're gonna be able to take advantage.
Yeah, I'll be having spring break will be a thing in my life, I guess, coming up at some point.
Yeah, that's a brilliant excuse. You got to leverage that. I mean, it's one of those benefits of parenting. Like, you don't want to miss out on that.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to it.
So last week, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, released their latest installment of their sixth climate change assessment. And not too surprisingly, not a very happy story. Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, called it a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. And while, the headlines may make you want to curl up in the fetal position, I do still think there are some hopeful pieces from all of it. So let's get the depressing shit out of the way. The world has already warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius. According to the report, they're now on the order of 3.3 billion people that are now highly vulnerable to climate change. And as some may already know, those most vulnerable folks are the least responsible for climate change. And the other thing the report talked about is the fact that we're seeing more, they call like compounding effects, where you have high temperatures combined with, let's say, low precipitation, and then you end up with a much worse, let's say, drought than you otherwise would have. For me, those were kind of the high points in terms of the bad news. I think pivoting to more of the hopeful news, there is still time to act. Like, it's absolutely not too late for us. And every fraction of warming matters. So whether we're talking about 1.1 degrees or 1.5 or 1.6, everything matters in terms of reducing risk. And the other thing they point out is, really, in this next decade, this is our chance to decide which direction we want to go. If we act swiftly and take robust action, it puts us on that lower risk trajectory, right? There's still going to be problems, but we're going to be in a much better space. For me, the takeaway is really solving climate change is doable, but it's going to require all of us. It's not something where we can have people sitting on the sidelines, because the reality is, if everybody gets involved that cares, it's going to drive the political change that we need. Gents, I don't know, you have thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think, Jason, it's a bit of a stark reminder as you read through it about all the climate disasters that we've seen already, and the fact that this is only going to continue to get supercharged as we continue to delay our response. But at the same time, I think we need to not take it as a piece of demoralizing literature, but more as a kick in the rump to hurry up. We need to go and do the right thing. We know what we need to do now. We just need to execute.
Yeah, I agree. And I like that. We'll use, from now on, Todd and I will use kick in the rump instead of kick in the butt when we're talking about the need to get going on stuff. It feels more classy, doesn't it? I mean, a kick in the rump versus a kick in the butt.
Yeah. It's funny, a damning indictment of failed climate leadership. All of these reports that seem to keep coming out, it's all a lot of the same story, right? Maybe it's like one of those things where you have to keep telling people things multiple times before it finally sinks in. I think to your point about hope in the next generation, like even here in Portland, I just saw that basically student-driven forced, Portland Public Schools to accept a climate plan. It just is a good sign, too, that obviously the next generation, they're thinking about this and they're on top of this.
I agree. And I think, ironically, in many ways, the students, children are taking a leadership role when many adults have yet to sort of step up. So maybe we need to take our cue from all these kids who aren't waiting to feel like they have the talking points or worrying about carving out time. They're just doing it, and I think that's what we all need to do. And if we do, I have no doubt that we're going to drive the type of response that's needed to get us where we need to be. So moving from one, cheery topic to another, this week's reason for hope actually comes from the hard to watch situation in Ukraine. I know there's, at least personally, like feeling a lot of like mix of like anger and fear and anxiety about it. But I think the conflict does create an opportunity for the EU, which gets 40% of its natural gas from Russia, to use this as a way to accelerate their transition to renewable energy and away from fossil fuels. The International Energy Agency actually released kind of a 10-point plan that talks about that and lays out really a roadmap for the European Union to cut its reliance on Russian gas 30% within a year. And a lot of that comes from accelerating, wind and solar, maximizing bioenergy and nuclear, ramping up energy efficiency, conserving energy. So while the conflict itself is a terrible thing, when looking through a climate lens, I think it's an opportunity to accelerate us away from these fossil fuels that are going to continue to create these geopolitical issues.
Obviously, there's some market forces and things that are very complicated that make this thing very difficult. But I think the simple thing is, if there is no market or the market is very small, it doesn't make it as big of a deal, right? And it is a big deal because the market for all this stuff is huge.
Totally. Well, let's hop into today's topic, aviation. And I know, as a lot of us are, being climate conscious, it's easy to feel guilty when you're, contemplating hopping on an airplane these days. And, a single international flight can have a big, carbon impact. So Thomas, as a pilot and somebody who's more familiar with aviation than the two of us, how should we be thinking about kind of the efficiency of flying compared to, say, driving or other modes of transportation?
Yeah, look, I mean, it depends how you look at it. If you're looking at it from getting an individual from A to B, it can be relatively efficient if you're comparing running a vehicle on fossil fuels versus an aircraft. But from transporting a weight perspective, yeah, it's relatively terrible. That's why ground-based freight or sea freight is typically orders of magnitude cheaper per kilogram moved than air. And that's driven primarily by basic laws of physics. When we hop in an airplane, we expect to fly near the speed of sound between continents. And in doing that, the drag is significantly higher. You put your hand out the window of a vehicle at 20 miles an hour and you feel the wind force against it. And then you start doing 100 miles an hour and it's significant. Every time you double the velocity, the drag's gone up by 4 times and power requirement by 8. So it's expensive from an energy perspective. There's no doubt about it. So I think the important thing to keep in mind that a person traveling in a medium to long haul flight is going to use about the same amount of energy per mile covered as a person driving a relatively efficient car, a single person driving that efficient car. If you go and put 5 people in that vehicle, then yes, it's going to be significantly more fuel efficient to travel via ground-based transit.
So that kind of gets at the idea of like not just thinking about miles per gallon, but thinking sort of about miles per gallon per passenger, right? Like, in other words, if you pack a plane full, the same is true, right? The plane has a certain fuel efficiency, but if you fill it full of passengers, obviously that miles per gallon per passenger is better. And then if I'm understanding you right, the same would be true, right, with a car. So if you have a car that gets, let's say, 40 miles to the gallon, that may not be as good as an average, medium to long haul flight at, say, over 50. But if you put all of a sudden 4 people in that car, then you're doing much better. So let's get to our guest today. Michael Wolcott is a Regents Professor and Associate Vice President of Research at Washington State University, where he's been a member of the faculty since 1996, conducting research in the field of bio-based materials, chemicals, and fuels. He currently serves as the Director of Ascent, the FAA Center of Excellence for Alternative Jet Fuel and the Environment, and was formerly Project Co-Director of the Northwest Advanced Renewables Alliance. Well, Mike, welcome to Climate Optimists.
Thanks. Appreciate being here today.
Well, let's start with a question that we ask all our guests. When you think about efforts to address climate change, what makes you hopeful?
You know, Jason, I think for a lot of this, it's easy to get discouraged about, our climate emissions and what kind of climate change is going to happen. Most of the news we see about this topic is fairly negative. It can even be classified as catastrophic in certain cases of this.
Right.
And obviously, it's something that we need to worry about. It is an incredibly important existential crisis. But I think what makes me most hopeful is, despite the differences of opinion that people have about this topic, I've seen continued progress through different administrations and things that get us further down the line as we've been working on this for a long time. And so while the progress may not be as fast as we want it to be, it may not be as fast as we need it to be, it really is making progress. And I think what's most encouraging is that the way that we're seeing absolute change oftentimes is not through government regulation, but is actually through the change in the marketplace. And we see this definitely with respect to just meeting the Obama era goals in terms of reduction of coal-generated electricity, even though that was overruled in many cases by the Supreme Court. We've actually made those targets already, and it didn't take the regulation to get there. And what we're seeing also is we're seeing companies like Microsoft and others that are really sort of taking their carbon footprint and their sustainability tenets seriously, and they're actually changing their business models to go forward with that. So I'm really encouraged that we're going to get to there. I have no idea in the crystal ball if we're going to make the IPCC targets in terms of things, but we just have to keep working on it.
Yeah. Well, and I like your point about things taking place or change happening despite, maybe not having certain regulations in place. That, it's just the recognition that there will be regulation at some point, or the potential regulation that helps, drive business in the direction that we want to go.
Yeah, and that's not to say that policy is not needed. In fact, when maybe we'll get a chance to talk about this a little bit later, but policy is really crucial to our making change. It's probably more the fact that, policy isn't always stable. And despite the fact that that we've seen a good deal of instability in a number of these policy areas, we're continuing to see progress. So
yeah. So thinking about, aviation, why are addressing carbon emissions more challenging than, other transportation sectors?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question because, transportation as a whole makes up a majority of our carbon emissions, in the United States. Aviation contributes roughly 12% of the carbon emissions of the transportation sector itself, around 3% to total U.S. Carbon emissions. So why should we even focus on aviation? Because it's 3% of our carbon emissions in the United States. So there's a lot larger ones in there. And why should we pay so much attention to that? So I think if we focus on the transportation areas for this, we have solutions that are moving forward commercially right now with light duty vehicle fleets. So the cars that you and I drive every day to get to the things that we need to do, we see electrification really sort of taking root. So that has to continue and probably isn't going fast enough. But from my perspective, that ship has sailed. But the question with flight and aviation is that there are two major components that make it a very difficult to decarbonize sector. One is the amount of energy that's required simply to have flight, to take flight, is very substantial. I mean, if you take a common long-haul flight and you look at just the takeoff and landing portion to that, that's a third of the overall fuel burn that takes place.
Wow.
And that's because, getting, an aircraft, a commercial aircraft, 737 or larger, off the ground, fully loaded, and into sustained flight, takes a lot of energy. And that energy has two primary criteria. One is that's part of the payload of the flight itself, right? So the aircraft needs to carry that fuel, and it needs to carry it in a fairly limited volume space. So the power requirements for those are substantial. But then secondly is that, if we take a flight from Portland and you're going to land in Spokane, Washington, you might do that because of convenience. It's not
Sure.
really a necessity to do that, because you could drive a little bit of a long drive, but you could easily do that. And so it's more convenient for you to take that flight. You might be able to fit it in a day instead of overnight. But you're not going to make a decision to drive from Portland to New York City or to Washington, D.C. for a meeting, because it might take you 3 days or 4 days just to get there, and then the same thing
Right.
coming back. So what happens is a lot of the commercial flight activity is really for these long haul flights. And it's that we travel so much further with aviation than we do with other modes of transportation. And so it's really important to understand that these issues with aviation not only are the power requirements and those sorts of components, but actually the distance of which we fly.
That's helpful. And so if I'm understanding you correctly, I mean, not only is it have massive energy requirements in a fairly small space in which to store that energy, in this case, fuel, but it's also that, if we were driving from, Portland to, let's say, New York City, you'd be making lots and lots of stops along the way to fill up your, the fuel tank of your vehicle, where in a flight, you don't have that option, right? You've got to take all the fuel that you need on board, and, that has to get you from A to B.
That's right. Exactly.
So you've kind of, I think, hinted at this already with the answer to your previous question, but how do, emissions shake out there? In other words, do the short flights, given that there's more of them, make up a fairly large share, or are the long flights, even though there's fewer, the bulk of the emissions?
Yeah, so definitely long haul flights, medium haul flights are the vast majority of the emissions from the aviation industry. It's not that these regional flights or shorter ones don't play a role, but they're much lower amounts of the greenhouse gas emissions than the long haul flights. That's just because of the cumulative miles that exist within there, right? On top of that, the smaller planes, like a Dash 8, is actually a more efficient plane that exists in there. Part of it is because it's a turboprop rather than a jet engine on there. It flies at a lower airspeed than does a commercial jet does, and it can because it's a shorter flight, and it's just a lighter aircraft overall. So it's kind of interesting if you go on to, not advertising Google Flights on there to book your tickets, but if you go on to there, actually, they'll show a carbon emission for that flight underneath there, and you can look at a Portland to Spokane flight, let's say, and you'll see actually two levels of carbon emissions. And one of those is a jet aircraft, and the other one is a turboprop. I can't vouch for how accurate they are, but the relative, nature of that is fairly representative. It's one of the reasons why we see Horizon, our local airline for regional flights, fly a lot of Dash 8s, because they're really efficient, and that efficiency translates into less fuel expenses.
So when we're talking emissions, the longer flights make up a bigger share. And, among the shorter flights, the aircraft that are available are more efficient. So that's another sort of benefit in terms of reducing overall emissions. Well, and I guess leads to kind of the next question, which is like, what are the most promising solutions out there for cutting emissions?
Yeah, so the aviation industry looks at this on a multi-pronged basis. So there's really three major components to that. One is the actual operations of the flight themselves. So how fast you fly, what elevations you fly, what are the directness of the routes. All of these types of factors influence sort of fuel burn as a whole. So that's one component that can be addressed, is just simply the operations. Then next is actual aircraft technologies themselves, and those that are aimed particularly at reduction of fuel burn. And these two fuel burn pieces are so important because everybody wins for that, right? Because in terms of the airlines, 60% of their operating expenses are purchasing fuel. So
Wow.
if they,
massive.
reduce the amount of fuel that's needed, then they save money. They could pass off savings to us as passengers. So we've seen a continued efficiency improvement in the air fleet with time. As a passenger, maybe the most visible thing for that is probably somewhere, I don't know exactly when it was, maybe 15 years ago, you started seeing those little winglets on the end of the wings, right? The little vertical pieces to that. Those are actually put on there to reduce fuel burn. So there's many other technologies that you don't see so much, or maybe not so obvious as a passenger. We see a lot of lightweighting of the aircraft themselves, a lot more use of composites. We really saw this come forward in the Boeing 787. What those composites also did was allow much longer wings. So if you fly on one, you'll notice that the wingspan is much longer for the width of the wing. So it's a higher aspect ratio, which are much more efficient. So we see, actual shapes of the aircraft themselves that change, or just the weight of the aircraft itself. We also see material changes in the engine so that the engines can burn more efficiently. So what we see is these cumulative, all these technology changes can really sort of assist in terms of just reduction of fuel burn itself. And then greenhouse gas emissions are basically proportional to the fuel burn. So those two are two pieces that the aircraft manufacturers, engine manufacturers, all of these are working hard on. And FAA is really looking at in terms of operational things that they control from a regulatory basis. The last part, though, is really lowering the greenhouse gas intensity of the fuel itself. And
Right.
And this is, despite the importance of those other two factors, this is really going to be the major component that helps to get the aviation industry to a net zero standpoint. So IATA, which is the International Aviation Transport Association, so it covers the entire aviation industry. In their goals of setting to get to net zero, they estimate that roughly 65 to 70% of the carbon savings that they're going to need to get to a net zero basis is going to come from the production of sustainable aviation fuels. So aviation fuels that simply have lower carbon intensity because of how they're made. And largely that's getting away from conventional fuels, which occur from fossil fuels. We also hear a lot about fuel switching in a different way. So that's moving from a conventional fuel to a sustainable aviation fuel. But the other way that we hear a lot in the news about more and more lately is switching to either hydrogen flight, the role that green hydrogen might play, or electrification. This gets a lot of press and news. It is actually very promising, but it's not going to help us in the time frame we need to decarbonize aviation. So sustainable aviation fuels are going to be the major part, and these other ones are going to contribute definitely.
So as I'm thinking about this, being a mechanical engineer, I'm, quickly going to the car analogy. And so when you talked about those three buckets, I'm envisioning kind of the same sort of buckets with a car. You have the improvements in technology that make the car more efficient, like, most people are familiar with hybrid cars. You have the way you drive the car. So obviously, putting your foot to the floor is not going to generate as good a fuel economy. And then the third is, what are you putting into your fuel tank? And it sounds like in the aviation sector, that's really the crux at this point of getting to net zero, is getting a fuel that you can put in your tank that is low or zero emissions.
Right. And that's a really good analogy, Jason, on there, because the auto industry is taking a lot of these similar types of steps in terms of reducing that.
So exciting. So it's, it seems like aviation is making a lot of incremental progress. I guess I'm curious, given how, essential the fuel is to being able to decarbonize, kind of where are we today?
Right. So where we are with the production and use of sustainable aviation fuels right now is we have 7 certified pathways. So pathways that are certified by ASTM that then can be flown on commercial flights. So that's a huge step. We have a variety of different feedstocks that can be used through those pathways. So it's not all relying on growing one type of material or utilizing one waste source. The downside of this is that we have a fairly limited production compared to the overall fuel that we use. We do have commercial plants here in the United States. The one commercial plant is right outside of LAX. It's called World Energy. And we have 2 commercial plants that are in various stages of construction right now. One is actually in Oregon, down in Lakeview, Oregon. And and the other one is in Reno, Nevada. And then there are multiple sort of announcements or groups that are saying that they're going to be putting it in, or that they already have production of, say, renewable diesel, which they can easily modify that process and produce sustainable aviation fuels. So there is a lot of promise, but we definitely need more in production. And so one of the questions would be is, why don't we have more in production right now? And there's really kind of 2 factors that play a role. One of those factors is that there's a significant amount of capital that's required to build one of these plants. It's hundreds of millions of dollars, sort of to get into this business. And so, getting access to that sort of capital on what's perceived to be a new technology just raises interest rates, and because of risks associated with that. That leads to the other issue that's there, is where government should and needs to play a role within these sorts of issues that are important to society, is in de-risking that private capital. So if there's a high risk associated with that, then that's the goal of our governments, should be to take the risk out of the private capital, let the private capital build these plants and start commercial production, but take on the risk, because you're going to have failures in any new technologies, right? There are a number of programs that are both state and federal to do that, but we haven't seen a tremendous amount of stability in those programs. Programs, especially on the federal side, will go up and down with administrations and priorities that they might have.
So it's exciting to hear that there are fuels out there today, aviation fuels that are more sustainable. And I guess I'm wondering, in this equation of decarbonizing our aviation sector, where do carbon offsets fit?
Yeah, so right now, offsets are viewed as a component that bridges between the time of today and when we have substantial amounts of sustainable aviation fuel in place. But what's really important is to actually own those carbon emissions that you actually have. So offsets shouldn't replace these other technologies to improve fuel burn, to lower the carbon intensity of the fuel itself. Those are important to go forward. But if we're going to start to decarbonize right now, then we need to, then the industry views sort of investing in these offsets as a way to offset their carbon emissions until they have these other technologies that are put in place. But what's also really important is to make sure that these are real and verifiable systems for that, and set up ways of accounting for those pieces.
Yeah, our listeners have heard us talk, in a couple episodes about the criticality of getting offsets right going forward, given some of the challenges, that have existed in the past, and offsets of questionable quality and so forth. So that leads me to, maybe my last question, which is, when we're thinking about this transition that's underway, and, you already mentioned the importance of government in that, what can be done when we think about this as sort of individuals? How can we help affect change and enable the aviation industry to accelerate more quickly to net zero?
So I did sort of touch on this earlier, but I think the one big barrier that we have right now is actually stable and effective government policy. It's really important for the government to play a role in this area. I think the role is really in terms of de-risking the private capital and the industries to commercialize these technologies. As I had indicated, we have seen some policies that are quite effective that are already stood up. The issues are, twofold. One is stability of the policy across different administrations. And then secondly is that some of the policy in place in the U.S. in particular really prioritizes ground transportation, and especially in the area of renewable fuels. So what's important is at least to have those on even footing, so that a producer won't lose money by producing an aviation fuel, which is what happens today. And then lastly, I'd say is more companies sort of following the pathway of Microsoft and starting to own their own carbon emissions and set up programs to do that. And I have no stock in Microsoft, but I'm just impressed by how they've worked with the World Economic Forum, how they're sort of working with aviation sector in terms of helping to bridge the cost difference between sustainable aviation fuels and conventional fuels, which is essentially buying the environmental services that these fuels provide. And so the more that companies sort of move in this framework of sustainability tenets that are real and effective, then that's the other route of this that comes more from the private sector rather than, say, from governmental programs.
Well, it's exciting to see, Microsoft taking those measures, and it's certainly something I think all of us as consumers can, shine a light on those companies, not only the ones that are struggling, but the ones that are doing sort of forward-thinking work. And, hopefully you see other, the Amazons and the Googles following in Microsoft's, footsteps. Well, I think we could continue to talk about sustainable aviation for longer than, longer than this interview, but just wanted to say thank you for making time to come on and talk to us about, the aviation sector, get us a little smarter on, what's being done and what still needs to be done to, to get to a place where we can all hop on that flight and feel good from a climate perspective.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me here, and thanks for doing this podcast. I became aware of it when our mutual friend sort of introduced us to each other, and I really enjoyed your episodes. I think you hit the right spot. So thanks for having me on.
Happy to help. So, gents, what were your takeaways from our interview with Mike?
I was actually surprised to find that when he said that, they could reduce the carbon intensity of the fuel possibly by like 60+%. It sounds like we need to build some pretty expensive facilities to be able to do that. And obviously there's some risks there. I don't think, investors are quite on board with the tech yet. And, when you start talking about this being about 3%, you kind of wonder, and I know Thomas mentioned this earlier about, is this the low-hanging fruit that we want to try to get at? Is it a big enough chunk to worry about? I mean, I know we've talked before about we're gonna have to pull the numbers down anywhere we can, and so obviously this is one area to do that. But
in other words, clearly we need to cut emissions on all fronts. But
yeah,
if I'm understanding you correctly, like maybe this is when we talk about cutting emissions 50% by 2030, that may not be from aviation. Aviation may end up being the rest of the emissions we have to cut by 2050.
Yeah, it seems like it's going to be a little bit of a longer haul, and the percentage of what it contributes to the overall greenhouse, emissions, it's not huge, right?
Look, I mean, I think it's one of those things that we've got to accept a few laws of physics here. One is that to fly an aeroplane, you need extremely high energy density for your power source, and that's been the struggle with batteries. Right now we're looking at around 250 watt hours per kilogram. Realistically, to make even short haul flight viable, you've got to be talking north of 400 watt hours per kilogram. So we're still some years away before a lot of these European countries that have got their eyes set and hearts set on short haul domestic flights being done with electric aircraft. It's still a few years away, but long haul flights for quite some time to come is going to have to be done with fossil fuels not fossil fuels, with carbon-based fuels as the primary energy source. And we've got to accept that making those from renewables is expensive and is going to continue to be expensive for some time to come. So therefore, we should be doing whatever we can to pivot as much air transportation as possible back towards ground transportation, where we've already, cracked that nut. We've worked out how to make ground-based battery electric vehicles very efficient. So, we should, by all means, continue to focus on the development of renewable sources for aviation, but encourage the transition wherever possible to ground-based transportation or freight.
In other words, that could be in the form of folks having a battery, electric car to go on their, regional vacations or trips. And it could also be taking, money and setting it aside to develop, at least in the US, a real high-speed rail infrastructure so that those, trips between, maybe you're not doing a high-speed rail from, San Francisco to New York City, but if you're talking LA to San Francisco, or, here in the Northwest from Portland to Seattle, those would be easy trips to make with high-speed rail, and certainly much more efficient.
Absolutely, because high-speed rail has the benefit that aviation has in that you've got a whole lot of people stacked one behind the other. So the frontal area of the train or the aeroplane is very small. Unlike having a whole bunch of individual cars driving along a highway, and that's where China really kind of stepped over this whole domestic flight problem, from an emissions perspective that we've run into in the rest of the Western world. And they spent massively on high-speed rail 10 to 15 years ago. And because of that, the per person emission costs when traveling between cities in China is significantly less than what we see in the US, Australia, and Europe.
Yeah, it sounds like, there's obviously, based on what Mike was sharing, like some really promising technologies, and we need to continue with those. But I think, to both your points, rethinking how we travel and being smarter about, how we do it has a big impact, right? And that gets almost in a way at what he was saying when he was talking about the 3 different ways that we're trying to reduce the emissions with aviation. And one of those is how you operate the planes. Well, operating the planes less and substituting that with, driving an electric car or, taking high-speed rail is one vehicle, right? While we continue to work out, ramping up these biofuels, which we clearly, need more government support there to get rid of that financial risk. Not unlike, we had in the beginning with solar and wind, right? Where you had banks that weren't willing to step up, or reluctantly stepped up to fund projects. It seems like a not so different situation that we have with aviation biofuels is being able to take that risk out for the banks so that these projects are able to scale up.
I think the other thing too that has been a bit of a silver lining to this whole coronavirus global pandemic is that people have realized that they can holiday locally. There is a lot that they can explore within a very short distance from where they live, and we've sort of become numb to the fact that when we hop on an airplane to travel to the other side of the world for a 2-week holiday, that with 60% of the cost of the ticket being allocated to fuel, that is a massive amount of fuel that we use every time we could do that. If we stopped and thought, well, what would it cost me in terms of liters of fuel to drive my car there, that's pretty much what it costs in terms of jet fuel that we're pumping into the atmosphere.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, if there was a road, from US to Europe, and you had to drive that with your car over the Atlantic Ocean, that would be an expensive trip.
Thomas, you might know this. Is the idea of an electric plane, have we theoretically sort of reached the point where we kind of know what the limitation of electric planes are going to be?
I mean, there are a number of both countries and private entities working on that right now, but like there are short haul flights. Not sure if they've started yet, but they've been doing some tests over the last couple of years in British Columbia to get out to the islands there. The issue really is that, sure, the weight of the electric motors has come down massively, but it's the battery energy density that we're still really struggling with. And hopefully in the next few years, if we continue to track the way we are with the energy density improvements, we can get there, but it's some time out yet.
Yeah, it makes sense. It kind of goes back to, a gallon of fuel weighs 6 pounds, somewhere around that, right? Roughly 6 pounds. Yeah. And it contains the same amount of energy as the battery in my Chevy Spark. That 1 gallon of fuel does, and that battery weighs 400 and some odd pounds, right? I mean, it's super heavy, and my Spark doesn't have to get off the ground though. So, and of course, the motor's efficient. That's why you get 80 plus miles out of that same amount of energy stored in that gallon of gasoline. but it's just a different problem with planes. It seems like a hard one to solve.
So, I think in recap, we, listening to Mike, there's clearly some promising work being done in the aviation sector. It's not going to be an easy sector to decarbonize, but there's some great work going on around, biofuels, continuing to, lighten planes, make them more efficient. And it sounds like the crux is really going to be, getting government to help make putting in more of these biofuel facilities lower risk so that they can scale up and we can actually start powering a fair amount of the fleet with biofuels. And then, at the same time, rethinking transportation and how we get ourselves around holistically. And, as Thomas mentioned earlier, it's like if you're a solo person traveling across the country, and you otherwise would be driving an SUV, you're better to get on that plane. But if you're talking about, a family of four going on vacation, driving that fuel efficient car is going to be a much more effective way to go. So I think that leads into, the question of, well, what can we do? And for this week, we'd like to call on folks to send a message to their senators that we need to, take up negotiations again on the Build Back Better bill and getting those climate provisions passed. We have a window in which still to do that, but that's getting smaller. And, and every time you get towards election cycles, it's harder to get legislation through. And, it's clear to me, whether we're talking about aviation or anything else, that if the U.S. is going to lead on climate, we need to have robust climate legislation in place. And the Build Back Better bill is our opportunity to do that at a federal level. So we'll have talking points on our website to help you with that, but encourage everybody to take the 5-10 minutes max to send that note to your senator, because the reality is if we all do it, it does have a real impact. Well, I think that's a wrap for this week. Thanks as always for tuning in. Come back next week for more climate solutions, reasons for hope, and ways each of us can make a difference. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimists Podcast.